Chapter 7. Gideon Spilett stood motionless upon the shore, his arms crossed, gazing on the sea, whose horizon was darkened towards the east by a huge black cloud mounting rapidly into the zenith. The wind, already strong, was freshening, the heavens had an angry look, and the first symptoms of a heavy blow were manifesting themselves. Herbert went into the chimneys, and Pencroff walked towards the reporter, who was too absorbed to notice his approach. "We will have a bad night, Mr. Spilett," said the sailor. "Wind and rain enough for Mother Carey's chickens." The reporter, turning, and perceiving Pencroff, asked this question. "How far off from the shore do you think was the basket when it was struck by the sea that carried away our companion?" The sailor had not expected this question. He reflected an instant before answering. "2 cables' lengths or more." "How much is a cable's length?" demanded Spilett. "About 120 fathoms, or 600 feet. "Then," said the reporter, "Cyrus Smith would have disappeared not more than 1,200 feet from the shore." "Not more than that." "And his dog, too?" "Yes." "What astonishes me," said the reporter, "admitting that our companion and Top have perished, is the fact that neither the body of the dog nor of his master has been cast upon the shore." "That is not astonishing with so heavy a sea," replied the sailor. "Moreover, it is quite possible that there are currents which have carried them farther up the coast." "Then it is really your opinion that our companion has been drowned?" asked, once more, the reporter. "That is my opinion." "And my opinion, Pencroff," said Spilett, "with all respect for your experience, is, that in this absolute disappearance of both Cyrus and Top, living or dead, there is something inexplicable and incredible." "I wish I could think as you do, sir," responded Pencroff, "but, unhappily, I cannot." After thus speaking, the sailor returned to the chimneys. A good fire was burning in the fireplace. Herbert had just thrown on a fresh armful of wood, and its flames lit up the dark recesses of the corridor. Pencroff began at once to busy himself about dinner. It seemed expedient to provide something substantial, as all stood in need of nourishment, so 2 tetras were quickly plucked, spitted upon a stick, and placed to roast before a blazing fire. The couroucous were reserved for the next day. At 7 o'clock Neb was still absent, and Pencroff began to be alarmed about him. He feared that he might have met with some accident in this unknown land, or that the poor fellow had been drawn by despair to some rash act. Herbert, on the contrary, argued that Neb's absence was owing to some fresh discovery which had induced him to prolong his researches, and anything new must be to Cyrus Smith's advantage. Why had not Neb come back, if some hope was not detaining him? Perhaps he had found some sign or footprint which had put him upon the track. Perhaps, at this moment he was following the trail. Perhaps, already, he was beside his master. Thus the lad spoke and reasoned, unchecked by his companions. The reporter nodded approval, but Pencroff thought it more probable that Neb, in his search, had pushed on so far that he had not been able to return. Meantime, Herbert, excited by vague presentiments, manifested a desire to go to meet Nebraska, but Pencroff showed him that it would be useless in the darkness and storm to attempt to find traces of the Negro, and that the better course was to wait. If, by morning, Neb had not returned, Pencroff would not hesitate joining the lad in a search for him. Gideon Spilett concurred with the sailor in his opinion that they had better remain together, and Herbert, though tearfully, gave up the project. The reporter could not help embracing the generous lad. The storm began. A furious gust of wind passed over the coast from the southeast. They heard the sea, which was out, roaring upon the reef. The whirlwind drove the rain in clouds along the shore. The sand, stirred up by the wind, mingled with the rain, and the air was filled with mineral as well as aqueous dust. Between the mouth of the river and the cliff's face, the wind whirled about as in a maelstrom, and, finding no other outlet than the narrow valley through which ran the stream, it rushed through this with irresistible violence. Often, too, the smoke from the chimney, driven back down its narrow vent, filled the corridors, and rendered them uninhabitable. Therefore, when the tetras were cooked, Pencroff let the fire smolder, only preserving some clear embers among the ashes. At 8 o'clock Neb had not returned, but they could not help admitting that now the tempest alone was sufficient to account for his non-appearance, and that, probably, he had sought refuge in some cavern, waiting the end of the storm, or, at least, daybreak. As to going to meet him under present circumstances, that was simply impossible. The birds were all they had for supper, but the party found them excellent eating. Pencroff and Herbert, their appetite sharpened by their long walk, devoured them. Then each one retired to his corner, and Herbert, lying beside the sailor, extended before the fireplace, was soon asleep. Outside, as the night advanced, the storm developed formidable proportions. It was a hurricane equal to that which had carried the prisoners from Richmond. Such tempests, pregnant with catastrophes, spreading terror over a vast area, their fury withstood by no obstacle, are frequent during the equinox. We can understand how a coast facing the east, and exposed to the full fury of the storm, was attacked with a violence perfectly indescribable. Happily the heap of rocks forming the chimneys was composed of solid, enormous blocks of granite, though some of them, imperfectly balanced, seemed to tremble upon their foundations. Pencroff, placing his hand against the walls, could feel their rapid vibrations, but he said to himself, with reason, that there was no real danger, and that the improvised retreat would not tumble about their ears. Nevertheless, he heard the sound of rocks, torn from the top of the plateau by the gusts, crashing upon the shore. And some, falling perpendicularly, struck the chimneys and flew off into fragments. Twice the sailor rose, and went to the opening of the corridor, to look abroad. But there was no danger from these inconsiderable showers of stones, and he returned to his place before the fire, where the embers glowed among the ashes. In spite of the fury and fracas of the tempest, Herbert slept profoundly, and, at length, sleep took possession of Pencroff, whose sailor life had accustomed him to such demonstrations. Gideon Spilett, who was kept awake by anxiety, reproached himself for not having accompanied Nebraska. We have seen that he had not given up all hope, and the presentiments which had disturbed Herbert had affected him also. His thoughts were fixed upon Neb. Why had not the negro returned? He tossed about on his sandy couch, unheeding the warfare of the elements. Then, overcome by fatigue, he would close his eyes for an instant, only to be awakened by some sudden thought. Meantime the night advanced, and it was about 2 o'clock when Pencroff was suddenly aroused from a deep sleep by finding himself vigorously shaken. "What's the matter?" he cried, rousing and collecting himself with the quickness peculiar to sailors. The reporter was bending over him and saying, "Listen, Pencroff, listen." The sailor listened, but could hear no sounds other than those caused by the gusts. "It is the wind," he said. "No," answered Spilett, listening again, "I think I heard." "What?" "The barking of a dog." "A dog!" cried Pencroff, springing to his feet. "Yes, the barking." "Impossible," answered the sailor. "How, in the roarings of the tempest?" "Wait, listen," said the reporter. Pencroff listened most attentively, and at length, during a lull, he thought he caught the sound of distant barking. "Is it?" asked the reporter, squeezing the sailor's hand. "Yes, yes," said Pencroff. "It is Top! It is Top!" cried Herbert, who had just wakened, and the three rushed to the entrance of the chimneys. They had great difficulty in getting out, as the wind drove against them with fury, but at last they succeeded, and then they were obliged to steady themselves against the rocks. They were unable to speak, but they looked about them. The darkness was absolute. Sea, sky, and earth were one intense blackness. It seemed as if there was not one particle of light diffused in the atmosphere. For some moments the reporter and his two companions stood in this place, beset by the gusts, drenched by the rain, blinded by the sand. Then again, in the hush of the storm, they heard, far away, the barking of a dog. This must be Top. But was he alone or accompanied? Probably alone, for if Neb had been with him, the Negro would have hastened, at once, to the chimneys. The sailor pressed the reporter's hand in a manner signifying that he was to remain without, and then returning to the corridor, emerged a moment later with a lighted faggot, which he threw into the darkness, at the same time whistling shrilly. At this signal, which seemed to have been looked for, the answering barks came nearer, and soon a dog bounded into the corridor, followed by the three companions. An armful of wood was thrown upon the coals, brightly lighting up the passage. "It is Top!" cried Herbert. It was indeed Top, a magnificent Anglo-Norman, uniting in the cross of the two breeds those qualities, swiftness of foot and keenness of scent, indispensable in coursing dogs. But he was alone. Neither his master nor Neb accompanied him. It seemed inexplicable how, through the darkness and storm, the dog's instinct had directed him to the chimneys, a place he was unacquainted with. But still more unaccountable was the fact that he was neither fatigued nor exhausted nor soiled with mud or sand. Herbert had drawn him towards him, patting his head, and the dog rubbed his neck against the lad's hands. "If the dog is found, the master will be found also," said the reporter. "God grant it," responded Herbert. "Come, let us set out. Top will guide us." Pencroff made no objection. He saw that the dog's cunning had disproved his conjectures. "Let us set out at once," he said, and covering the fire so that it could be relighted on their return, and preceded by the dog, who seemed to invite their departure, the sailor, having gathered up the remnants of the supper, followed by the reporter and Herbert, rushed into the darkness. The tempest, then in all its violence, was, perhaps, at its maximum intensity. The new moon had not sufficient light to pierce the clouds. It was difficult to follow a straight course. The better way, therefore, was to trust to the instinct of Top, which was done. The reporter and the lad walked behind the dog, and the sailor followed after. To speak was impossible. The rain, dispersed by the wind, was not heavy, but the strength of the storm was terrible. Fortunately, as it came from the southeast, the wind was at the back of the party, and the sand, hurled from behind, did not prevent their march. Indeed, they were often blown along so rapidly as nearly to be overthrown. But they were sustained by a great hope. This time, at least, they were not wandering at random. They felt, no doubt, that Neb had found his master and had sent the faithful dog to them. But was the engineer living, or had Neb summoned his companions only to render the last services to the dead? After having passed the smooth face of rock, which they carefully avoided, the party stopped to take breath. The angle of the cliff sheltered them from the wind, and they could breathe freely after this tramp, or rather race, of a quarter of an hour. They were now able to hear themselves speak, and the lad having pronounced the name of Smith, the dog seemed to say by his glad barking that his master was safe. "Saved? He is saved. Isn't he, Top?" repeated the boy. And the dog barked his answer. It was 2:30 when the march was resumed. The sea began to rise, and this, which was a spring tide backed up by the wind, threatened to be very high. The tremendous breakers thundered against the reef, assailing it so violently as probably to pass completely over the islet, which was invisible. The coast was no longer sheltered by this long breakwater, but was exposed to the full fury of the open sea. After the party were clear of the precipice, the storm attacked them again with fury. Crouching, with back still to the wind, they followed Top, who never hesitated in his course. Mounting towards the north, they had upon their right the endless line of breakers deafening them with its thunders, and upon their left a region buried in darkness. One thing was certain, that they were upon an open plain, as the wind rushed over them without rebounding as it had done from the granite cliffs. By 4 o'clock they estimated the distance traveled as 8 miles. The clouds had risen a little, and the wind was drier and colder. Insufficiently clad, the three companions suffered cruelly, but no murmur passed their lips. They were determined to follow Top wherever he wished to lead them. Towards 5 o'clock the day began to break. At first, overhead, where some grey shadowings bordered the clouds, and presently, under a dark band a bright streak of light sharply defined the sea horizon. The crests of the billows shone with a yellow light and the foam revealed its whiteness. At the same time, on the left, the hilly parts of the shore were confusedly defined in grey outlines upon the blackness of the night. At 6 o'clock it was daylight. The clouds sped rapidly overhead. The sailor and his companions were some 6 miles from the Chimneys, following a very flat shore, bordered in the offing by a reef of rocks whose surface only was visible above the high tide. On the left the country sloped up into downs bristling with thistles, giving a forbidding aspect to the vast sandy region. The shore was low, and offered no other resistance to the ocean than an irregular chain of hillocks. Here and there was a tree, leaning its trunks and branches towards the west. Far behind, to the southwest, extended the borders of the forest. At this moment Top gave unequivocal signs of excitement. He ran ahead, returned, and seemed to try to hurry them on. The dog had left the coast, and guided by his wonderful instinct, without any hesitation had gone among the downs. They followed him through a region absolutely devoid of life. The border of the downs, itself large, was composed of hills and hillocks, unevenly scattered here and there. It was like a little Switzerland of sand, and nothing but a dog's astonishing instinct could find the way. 5 minutes after leaving the shore the reporter and his companions reached a sort of hollow, formed in the back of a high down, before which Top stopped with a loud bark. The three entered the cave. Neb was there, kneeling beside a body extended upon a bed of grass. It was the body of Cyrus Smith,